Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Green, and I am the Artistic Director of the Houston Cinema Arts Festival. So welcome to the post-screening virtual conversation for Third Coast and Other Shores. And I'm so excited to be introducing the curator of this program, who is an incredible curator, programmer, writer, thinker, experimental film fan and expert. So this is going to be very special. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael Sicinki to the stage. And thank you so much, Michael, for everything.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a very generous introduction. I certainly appreciate it. So yes, this is the virtual Q&A for the program I put together, Third Coasts and Other Shores. And it's a collection of recent experimental films and videos, some from local Houston-based makers, and they will be talking about their work at the in-person screening. We also have a number of international filmmakers, and they've generously agreed to take part in this virtual Q&A. First, I'd like to introduce Lívia Sa, who is a Brazilian filmmaker currently based in Brooklyn. She made the film Land in Sight. And second, Paige Taul, who is based in Chicago currently and made the film Goat. So thank you very much. Welcome. And the first thing I wanted to maybe address, and either of you can take this up, the theme of this year's festival is Third Coast, which is a kind of historical idea about Houston and the Gulf Coast as occupying this kind of third space. You know, that the U.S. is conceived as being bicoastal, but there's this kind of argument, well, is it in fact tricoastal, and what is Houston's role in that? And I think that that idea of the third space, something Edward Soya wrote about, this idea of the third as kind of an excess or a supplement to traditional dialectics, instead of like two things in opposition. You know, what happens when you introduce the third? And so one of the things as a programmer I tried to consider was how the films in the program, including your films, dealt with issues of liminality, in some cases marginality, but perhaps just a representation of culture that departs from the dominant mainstream issues that are representations that we're usually inundated with. So with that in mind, I'd like to start by posing a question to you, Lívia. Your film Land in Sight is very interesting in that it, at first, I think, appears to represent or to depict a conflict between past and present, but in the course of the film, we realize that we're looking at the present all along. We're just looking at two different perspectives on the present. One being Indigenous protesters in traditional dress who are involved in a protest. And currently, of course, in Brazil, there's lots to protest, certainly from an Indigenous point of view. And then we also see appear to be beachcombers, vacationers, just having fun in the water. I was wondering if you could say something about how you conceived the relationship between those two image sets, and what you think you would like a viewer to kind of take from that juxtaposition.
Hi, thanks for having me. And yeah, I guess there's a lot to be said. I think, so the film starts with this shot of Monte Pascoal, which is the first spotted land by the Portuguese back in 1500. So there is this idea of, like, you know, approaching a land and discovering, but of course, you know, the Indigenous people were already there, and the genocide of the Indigenous people starts there. And then throughout the years, I think there are many places, you know, nowadays, and like, you know, it has always been like this, but the more the places get, you know, tourism and more people visiting these places, there are more people visiting such places that there are indigenous people who have been living there since the early day, and these people are, going through these genocides and like through a variety of, procedures, and it depends on which region we're talking about. But then I think it's very interesting to contrast like how does tourism plays a role in indigenous lands, right? Like how do people interact with the indigenous communities? And unfortunately, I don't think it's a very productive way. I mean, this is just my personal opinion. Of course, like I'm not the right person to be talking about this, but it's like, on my opinion, it's very unhealthy, and there are many problematic issues there. And so the film kind of documents this everyday tourism and people just chilling, while there is like there is a lot of history in the land that these people are choosing to go. Basically, that's kind of where I'm trying to go. So people just choose, a paradise, like, oh, I just want to spend New Year's Eve at this amazing place, without wanting to research about where they're going, without interacting with the locals, without having any understanding of like what has happened there, what happens there throughout the entire year, other than during the holidays. So I think, I was interested in capturing just everyday moments of like just how people are there, because I think for me, I like to document everyday moments, like just without like, oh, this is a film, we're going to start rolling, like in my personal projects, experimental projects, and like Land Inside, as an example, I'm interested in just capturing what unfolds naturally and organically, right? But the idea behind was to contrast like this whole history that's usually forgotten, and people are not even interested in knowing about it. Even the people who are going to these places, imagine those who don't even go there, even the people who claim that are going to these places and care about the history. Most of the time, I'm not saying 100%, of course, there are many people, who are trying to collaborate and learn or do something. But most of the time, there is this zoo effect, that people go to a place and they portray, as like, oh, here is an indigenous community, let me take a photo of them, and then they leave, and then they post on their social media. And this is becoming more and more, I guess, frequent with the whole social media selectivism, whatever you call it. So I think that was the idea behind trying to just document everyday moments, and then the protest, because then on the other hand, it's like, okay, who actually goes to these protests? When there is an indigenous protest, who is there? Are the people who are, going on holidays to their land? Are these people joining, their fight? Are these people going to the meetings? Are these people doing something? So there is that kind of on the background.
Right, that makes sense. And I guess one thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking, the question of tourism is always a fraught one, because it seems that there are at least two ways to be problematic, right? You can either people can come to these lands and completely ignore the indigenous residents, or the indigenous, and this is true, I think, in many different contexts, indigenous people can become a kind of authenticity fetish, right? Exactly. Where they become kind of enfolded into the tourism. And it seemed as though from your editing scheme, you were, at least until the end, kind of implying a rather radical separation: A-roll, B-roll, tourists, indigenous. So I guess I'm curious, in terms of the specific situation you were documenting, is it really more about ignoring these individuals, or do they end up becoming part of the fetishized tourism landscape?
I think both. I think there is a little bit of both, as in most contexts, and like, that could relate to this. But I think there is a little bit of both. Like, a lot of people just ignore they don't care. They just want to go on vacation and get drunk, and like and leave. And who cares about everything? Just we can talk about the indigenous communities who have been there. We can even go to many different places, like, oh, what about the trash that you were producing in an island? Like all of that. There's so many layers to this, right? And there is the other effect, as you said, the fetishized, effect that it's like, oh, we are here and like, let's, interact with the indigenous people and let's learn something and let's appreciate their culture. But which I think, there is always like, there's not a wrong, and I mean, I guess there is a wrong and right, but there is always a starting point. So I don't want to be this person that is like, oh, this is not valid. I think many actions are valid. However, as I said, I think, unfortunately, the majority of time, these people just want to take photos and say they were there and say they acknowledge the indigenous fight and leave, and this becomes, I think, problematic because it's like, okay, but what are you doing on your daily life? Like, what are you doing on other times when you are not there, like to do something about it, to at least learn about it, to at least talk about it, to so I think there is this effect that a lot of people just go there to many different indigenous communities in Brazil and want to be a part of rituals. There's so many other rituals that people go, and then like this whole thing of like massive media and digital content of like exposing, the ego, like, oh, we need to post and we need to do this and we need to do that. And I think, unfortunately, it lacks on some kind of substantial action and interaction, and I think it's also like, and this can also be problematic when it's like, oh, I'm making a film about indigenous problems and I'm not indigenous myself. And of course, this is something to be considered. And like, how do you make a film about, or how do you make a film with, right? And I think for me, it's like, I see more as collaborations, like the voice of Layla in my film. I think, the film couldn't be done without her narration, because I see more as like, how can we collaborate together to reverberate certain issues as the ones we're talking about, instead of going and like documenting and like, just leaving without this collaborative aspect.
Yeah, that makes. I was thinking. It reminded me of the famous line by Trin Minha: "Don't speak about, speak nearby," which is a kind of collaborative idea. So, Paige, I wanted to turn to you for a second. So, Goat is, among other things, a portrait film, and it seems, I haven't seen all of your work, but I've seen 4 or 5 of your films, and they tend to be organized around portraiture. And so I wanted to maybe start talking generally and then get into the specifics of Goat. What is your interest in cinematic portraiture, and what do you think that cinema as a medium contributes or brings to the table in terms of portraiture for your work?
That's a big question. But I love, I love nonfiction filmmaking or experimental nonfiction about people, because I think that people are already interesting. Like, I think there's a lot of, especially within my family, which is why I have so many works about people in my life, like my sister, my mom, my grandfather, is because they all sort of hold these personal mythologies, either about themselves or about other family members. And so I think you get this really interesting world building, especially when trying to remember an event or remember a person that happens in not only the language used to express, the way this person was, but also the emotion that comes out of that, which is why I like interviews so much. Like, I think that you can tell a lot about a person and the things that they're talking about by hearing about the things that they're speaking about, and also the way they're speaking about it. As far as like the history of cinematic portraiture, I think that it gives, I have a lot of freedom to move between abstract and literal interpretation. So I like nonfiction also because I don't have to invent the human form. Like people sort of already exist in a way in the world that I already find very interesting. But then also there's sort of abstract ways of these non-abstract things expressing themselves. And so I think I'm given a lot of freedom of interpretation, but also a really sort of solid foundation of the human form to fall back on, like expression and body language and cadence, voice, timbre, etc.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And of course, some of your films are silent. Goat is silent with sound, although they don't appear to be synchronized. So I guess with Goat in particular, I believe the subject was Malaya Hanna. Is that correct?
Malia Hanna.
Malia Hanna. I mean, she's charismatic. She's fascinating. I guess what drew you to her initially as a subject, and did you know from the beginning what kind of film you wanted to make with her?
Yes. So she's a really good friend of mine, and she had recently bought a pair of Jordans, and the amount of work that went into not only choosing the color of the shoe, but the style of the shoe was only, I guess, in competition with actually buying the shoe. Like it's very hard to find Jordans, especially of a specific color scheme, which I don't think she has one of the sort of historic color schemes, but they're difficult to find. And I think I've recently seen Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It. And so the way he introduces Mars Blackman's character is he has the haircut, the shoes, like a shot of the back of his head, the shoes, his bling. And then it's about this like sort of self-defining moment of this character. But then I don't agree with what he says about, his love interest with the main character. And so I thought that, this was a opportunity and a beautiful form, right? I love Spike Lee. Who doesn't like Spike Lee? But I thought this was a fantastic opportunity to redefine what that kind of style meant. So like a high top or a fade could be generally considered masculine, but here it's feminized. And I think it's a very elegant haircut. I did have one at one point, and I think there's something very feminine about that also. And then same with Jordans, you have like not only the evolution in style that was specific to a person or attached to a very specific era, but it's now significant of a particular culture that is evolving. And so I liked that.
Right.
You have her relationship to Jordans, which is also about style, but it's very different in the way that like Mars defines himself, or by proxy like Spike Lee, or by proxy the people that sort of built the legacy of Jordans starting in the 80s. So that's how I ended up talking to her about these shoes. And she has sneakerheads in her family, and so it felt very not like a tradition. I don't want to say it's that I don't want to say it's that like prevalent, but it is a familial interest. And so I liked that was sort of shared between her and her people. Yeah.
Right. And like you say, the interest in the shoes also brings up a kind of question of gender, in the sense that she acknowledges that Nike had not really been marketing or designing Jordans for women, and so I think it's toward the end of the film she makes the comment: "You wear the shoes, you don't let them wear you." Right. So it seemed like part of the idea here is that there's consumption that can be a creative act or an expressive act that is somehow maybe distinct from just conspicuous consumption, or simply just wanting to wear the nicest shoes. These objects are kind of imbued with a certain meaning for her that you seem to find specific. I mean, is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I mean, I agree with her. Like, does the shoe wear you or do you wear it? Like, there's a direction I think that you can come at being interested in a particular style. In this case, streetwear or like urban streetwear, which I have feelings against about that term, anyways. But you know, there's I mean, there's always been the case of posers, right? Like, what does it mean to be a part of a culture, and what does it mean to want to look like you're a part of a culture? And so that's where I think Jordan specifically come in, like what it meant to a certain group and what it meant to another group who wants to look like they belong or look like they understand this sort of initial, you know, collection of people who made the shoe popular, or who you know, were at the beginning of its propagation as an icon. Yeah.
Well, as we're talking, I kind of realized that there's a commonality between your two very different films that I hadn't really noticed before, which is silly because I've seen them both multiple times. But the idea of dress as expressive and as historical, as a series of, or a set of historical signifiers that call on cultural meanings. So I guess back to Lívia, when we're seeing the Indigenous protesters wearing what we take to be traditional garb, what do you think the film? What do you think the film's take on that is, as far as like how are we to understand their role in like using dress and pageantry as a form of, or as a component of protest?
I think so. That protest took place in São Paulo, where I'm originally from, and it took place at Avenida Paulista, so the major avenue in São Paulo. So I think it is, you know, and again, this is just an opinion. I think, of course, you know, they would.
You made the film. You're entitled to your own opinion.
Yeah, to the film. But I think it was very important to see it, like that huge contrast. You're in the middle of São Paulo, you're in the middle of downtown, you know, this massive city with millions of people and these gigantic buildings and everything. And then all of a sudden, there is like thousands of Indigenous people here protesting, and like they should not be here. You know, they should not have to come to downtown São Paulo to be fighting for their rights. And I think if they just came wearing like, you know, a shirt or something, you wouldn't be as effective, right? So I think that aspect, the visual aspect, it's a huge contrast that is kind of shocking when you are from the outside. At least for me was, you know, to be there and witness that and be like, you know, everything is wrong. Like these people are barefoot in the middle of Paulista because they are being taken from, you know, their lands, and they have to come all the way here to protest and make their voice heard. So I think when people are walking, you know, without even knowing about the protest, that, you know, captures everyone's attention. And I think the same is kind of for the film, because all of a sudden you have these contrasts of images and environments. Like there are also some images in the film that are in the Northeast, in Pernambuco, at a Maracatu gathering, which is like a ritual dance, cultural aspect that happens in Pernambuco. And then there, those images were shot where these events take place, right? So they were not taken outside of their environments to perform for audiences or, you know, whatever. You know, I was there watching and documenting. And I think that contrasts in the film, like when someone is in their original environment performing or living or just existing versus when they have to go out like to São Paulo. And I think how, you know, they're portraying themselves is very important, like aesthetically. I think it makes a huge point in life and consequently in the film.
Well, Paige, I wanted to follow. You both mentioned your interest in nonfiction, and perhaps start with putting this question to you, Paige. What do you think? I mean, there's certainly been in the last, say, 15 or 20 years a resurgent interest in nonfiction and documentation within the realm of experimental film and video. A kind of, at times I think I used a highfalutin term like non-argumentative cinema of reality or something like that. But it's you're not making documentaries, but you're using documentary material as the basis. So I guess I put to you the question: what do you think, as an artist, for your prospective viewer, what does this experimental form bring to the material that a more traditional non-fictional exposition kind of approach would not?
I think that it allows for more interpretation, or I think it's more forgiving in interpretation, both of the maker and of receptors, or like of an audience. I don't think that means like anyone can say anything about any sort of non-fiction experimental film, but I think that it removes some of the responsibility of fidelity, or not responsibility, some of the I don't know, chains of fidelity of saying, this is a box, it must only, like the thing that represents it must only look like or fit in this box. And so I think that's definitely something, even in my own practice, that I've struggled with is being okay with, or being more accepting of the freedom of infidelity. That sounds really strange, but I think that there's more creative liberty. And even recently, I used to say I was an experimental documentary filmmaker, but I don't like that anymore. I think I've been leaning towards experimental nonfiction filmmaking, because not only is the word documentary so loaded, I think that by saying that I do that, it ascribes a particular box that I don't know if I'll always fit in or want to fit in the future, or I guess in the present and past, whatever. But as far as I don't know. I mean, I think that it's strange. I have a couple of films that focus on people having to remember things. So like my grandmother trying to remember a story, but she's 90, so her memory is different than the way someone else may remember an event, but it doesn't make it untrue, right? And I think that there's I don't know, and saying it's experimental nonfiction allows the same liberty that you would give or have for someone remembering an event, in that there's a different interpretation or a different sort of record holding or record keeping.
Right, because I mean, as you're talking about the struggle to remember, and that being kind of built into the film, it gives that memory a kind of tangible material weight that I suppose a more straightforward representation would not. You could document someone who's having trouble with memory, and then it becomes about the failure of memory, but you can also approach it more experimentally, that it is giving this particular form or iteration of memory its due, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
And I want to turn it back to Lívia on this similar question, but but something just came to mind. Paige, the films of yours I've seen are relatively short, or 2 to 3 minutes tops, and I've always been interested in filmmakers who work in that mode, because I think there's, as a programmer, there's a tension between how one of your films is going to convey in a larger program versus how one would come to understand each individual film as part of a larger project if they're seen all at once. I guess, do you have thoughts or attitudes about how any given film of yours stands on its own versus how it falls in sequence as far as a larger artistic project?
I've always thought serially as far as filmmaking. I think it definitely came from undergrad. Like there was a lot of pressure for a certain amount of films, and it didn't in such a short amount of time, and I didn't know if it would make sense to me to have them be totally unrelated. And so I like that each film sort of gives permission for the subject of the next film. So it's like, oh, my mom mentions having kids, so the next one's about my sister and I, and then my sister talks about my dad, so the next one's about my dad, and then that's also back to my mom who talks about her mom, so the next one's about my so it keeps going.
Right.
And I think in that way, I think they always work in threes. Like I think of my works, you could pick any three and they all sort of make sense together. And I like that, yeah, you can shuffle them and make a new kind of sense with each segment, but then they also have their own sort of independent, discrete borders from the others. But I think, as far as why they're so short, I like shooting on a Bolex, and I like the economy of storytelling because you only get so much time, and in that amount of time, you can only talk about so much. And so I think it's a great practice in efficiency, but also now as I continue to make work, I don't know if efficiency is always necessary,
Right.
because there are some, ideas, concepts, projects that need more time, that need more than 3 minutes to be sort of open and closed. Like I think, some of the works work that at that length because they're punchy, or it's a closed book, so to speak, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it's just interesting because I think you're one of a number of filmmakers working today who are really the films, like you say, they kind of expand off of each other. They're not like entirely modular in the kind of minimalist sense, but that you see a project kind of building across time from film to film, and I think that's really interesting. It's kind of to my mind, it kind of works against the sort of masterpiece fetish, right? That you're going to make the long, grand Gesamtkunstwerk that kind of explains everything. That it's more like, I don't know, printmaking or something like that. Working in series is a really I think it sets up an interesting relationship between the film and the viewer. So to backtrack, Lívia, your thoughts about what experimentalism brings to or even takes away from the documentary urge?
So I think, I also have sometimes a hard time with the labels and how do I define and how does I label this genre or that, but I think overall I like the idea of experimental because it gives freedom, right? And I think for me, the whole process of creating my personal projects is based on freedom and organic process. So I work as a freelancer, doing mainly camera stuff. So usually when I am on a set, it's everything is more, okay, we have the shot list and then the lighting needs to be like this. And then this has to be like that. And if something unexpected happens, we need to cut, reshoot, there's all of these protocols. And I think when I'm doing my personal projects, I like to go 100% the other way around. It's okay, I want to have the freedom to incorporate unexpected events. I want to have the freedom to incorporate organic moments that are unfolding in front of me that I was not anticipating. So if I'm shooting something and someone walks in front of the camera, I don't want to necessarily be oh my God, this just ruined my shot. I want to just let it roll and see what's going to happen there, so I like this whole freedom of creativity and like documenting moments of life, like fragments of life. So I think that's usually my starting point when I'm shooting on Super 8. And I think, as Paige said, like the Bolex, that you have a certain amount of time, Super 8, you also have a certain amount of time. So it's like very different than when we're shooting digitally, that nowadays we're always like, let's make sure we have all the shots and let's make sure we have all the angles and let's keep on rolling because we want to, have it. And then you go to the editing room when you have hours and hours of footage. And I mean, that's just one process, but I love the idea of shooting in film because I'm like, okay, I have 2 rolls of like Super 8, I have 5-6 minutes to film and that's it. And when it's done, and like, so I like this limitation also, that contrast with the freedom, because I have this whole freedom throughout these 5 minutes, but it's also limited. So it's not that I can just keep on going forever. So there is an intention, like every time I'm like gonna shoot something, I'm like, okay, there is a presence more than an intention, I guess. There is like, it really requires for me to be present because every second costs, I don't know, like a lot. So you're like, I cannot waste, rolls of film, I cannot waste. But again, with the freedom to incorporate whatever is happening in front of me. So I say, it can be called, I guess, an experimental documentary because I am documenting what is in front of me, but through this experimental approach of not trying to control an environment. Because every time I'm working on a conventional documentary, it's like, okay, is the lighting perfect? Even a documentary and not a not a fiction set. Right. But like, is the lighting good? Hold on. Is this person, wearing which color with the background? We're controlling everything. So I like to not control anything within the limits of the time that I have to do so.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for mentioning, because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, which is that you shoot on Super 8. I mean, do you edit digitally or on? Okay, so what is there a particular? I mean, other than the time limit, is there a particular kind of quality that draws you to Super 8 as opposed to 16 or digital?
I like the texture of Super 8 a lot. Like, I love analog media in general. So I also like 16 millimeter and like other types of analog media. Usually my works, like even this film, Land in Sight, it has a whole other component that can be presented as an installation that uses a retro projector, a slide projector, and it becomes a whole other thing. So I like to incorporate different media and expand. But with Super 8 specifically, I started using, I guess, originally because of like how mobile and free I could be just on my own. Like this idea of like, it's just me and a camera anywhere. Like I don't rely on like, oh, I need the changing bag to load the film like you have, with 16 millimeter. There is a whole other production aspect that you need to keep in mind, and sometimes it's fine, but like on the type of projects that I'm doing, I was always like, no, I just want to have this camera as I'm traveling, as I'm like going to different places, as I am experiencing, new situations. So I like this freedom that the Super 8 camera gives me, but I love also the texture of it, because I think a lot of my projects also deal with time. Like even Land in Sight is not the first layer of the film, obviously, but it is somewhere there that it's like, oh, okay, this is in the present moment, but it could be in the past. And it is about the past. It is about something that has been happening for, over 500 years. So it's like, it has been happening for decades, but it's been shot kind of now. And even now people are like, oh yeah, this was shot during the Bolsonaro government. I'm like, actually, no, it was in 2018, So, and I like how the whole Super 8 texture plays with this idea of like time and memories, because I think automatically when someone is watching Super 8 film, they connect with the past. So I like to explore that sometimes it's in the present, but also talking about the past.
Yeah, that makes sense. As a kind of artifactual quality to it, just by dint of being an outmoded medium. Well, that kind of made me think, Paige, about your films in terms of experimentalism. Your films are, and Goat is a perfect example of this, are incredibly tight. They're very compact and replete with information and sensations. So how much, when you're working on a film, like how much of that is just kind of going into the situation, seeing what you can find, and then constructing it in the editing room, or how much planning do you engage in with these works?
So I think so as far as structuring, I love starting with the interview. I think people sort of like candy wrap their statements, so you have pauses at the beginning and the end of a sentence or of a phrase. And so I often start with that, of like, well, what do I think are the bones of this discussion? And so with my Leah's interview, it was I need to have this phrase of like, who wears the shoe, or does it wear you, at the end, because that's a place to land. But where do I find her interest in the shoe, or the description of the color, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a place to start. I think Goat was a little unusual because the shots are it's a shot for shot sort of remake of that scene in the movie, or just the beginning.
Oh, okay.
In She's Gotta Have It, of Mars's intro. So I already knew I had to have the back of the head, the shoes, the front of her face, and things like that, sort of moving at the beginning, and then everything else was unplanned, or not unplanned, but everything else was happened there. And so I already had this like really concrete structure to base the visuals on, and then let loose from there. But as far as like putting it all together, it was definitely, I always start with the with films that have interviews, I start with the audio, because it's the most, I think it's the most fun to like sort of move around where and what somebody said, to sort of change the tone or change the context. Not too much, obviously, but to influence the material.
No, that makes sense, because the human speech inevitably has these rhythms and cadences that can then maybe inform what you're going to do with the images and how you're going to juxtapose them. No, that makes. And just as a side note, when I saw the title Goat, I assumed it means greatest of all time. But it's kind of sets the, at least for me, it set the viewer up for thinking that basketball itself and shooting hoops was going to be much more central to the film than it actually did. It ends up being more about the sneakers. And so I'm just kind of wondering, did you conceive that as a certain kind of setting up an expectation to move in another direction, or was that just my own weird viewing?
I think as far as the title, so yes, it is like an acronym for greatest of all time, but it's also the name of the site where you can buy Jordans.
Oh, okay.
Because, and I liked I do like hearing what the title meant for you, because it does sort of set up this like really intense expectation of oh, this is a sports film,
right? And
then you watch it and it's sort of to the left of sports, and it's not even the shoe being sort of used in the way it was meant to be used, right? And then you have this sort of like, I guess, cheeky effort in recreating the sport because she can't reach the hoop, because basketball is no joke. But I think that part of the title is the site, but also the acronym, and also the sport.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe as a kind of exit question to wrap up, I mean, I think it's perhaps significant or important to kind of acknowledge that folks who are going to be watching this Q&A will be streaming these films rather than seeing them in a theater. Of course, somebody could go to the live screening and then stream them later. But it seems that there has been a significant set of shifts in terms of how experimental media is received or consumed. That shift was kind of happening anyway, but then COVID kind of accelerated that. So we're kind of in not a whole new ball game, but definitely somewhere quite different than we were 20 years ago as far as exhibition. So I guess a question I would kind of ask to both of you is, what do you think you would like to see as far as experimental film and video as a medium kind of continuing, working to find its audience? If things are going to change necessarily, how do you want to be a part of that change, and what would you like that to be?
Okay, maybe I can start. I don't know. I'm just gonna talk as I think about it.
Yeah.
But
we can pretend I never asked the question. Yeah.
No, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is the interaction with actual public spaces. So I think this whole thing of like just consuming media, being, experimental or not, just through our laptops, and even worse through our cell phones, the more this becomes frequent, I think the more it moves away from what originally inspired me to work with experimental media, which is the sensorial aspect of experiences, of being present at a space at a certain moment at a certain time. So I think
right, and you're also a gallery artist, right? So this space of the screen and the viewer versus entering the space where the screen is a component. I mean, that's something that's kind of endemic to your practice. Is that right?
I mean, yes, sometimes yes, but I think even within, like, I guess, yeah, my projects have been presented in so many different contexts that, like, in the sense of like, oh, is this just, a gallery, like a white box, or is it a gallery that we're turning everything upside down? You know what I mean? Like, so it varies. But I think the idea of being physical, physically present at a space, for me, is something that I would love that it doesn't go away. I wish it wouldn't go away as fast as it is. So I think now that COVID is kind of, going away, of course, it's still going to take some time to fully happen, but that we don't lose this point and become 100% used to like just doing everything virtually. I think the virtual aspect of it is amazing. Like right now we're talking, 3 different places, and I appreciate that. And I think there is an enormous value in that. But I think that we still continue, when I think about, as you ask, like what I hope to be a part of, I hope to be physically presenting projects where people can, join in the physical world, but also virtually if they are, in different places. And I think especially in public spaces, because I think this whole idea of like, oh, this, a gallery and like turning projects into like this, you need to get a ticket, you need to, go there and like be invited. I don't know. I like the idea of like intervention in actual public spaces where anyone can walk and be impacted by a work and have, even if like a 5-second experience, but I that's what I hope to do and be a part of as I continue to experiment with media.
Sounds great. Okay, Paige, the future. How about it?
Oh, Jesus. I would have to agree. I mean, I think, Lívia, you said it very well as far as what is currently being missed. Like, is this, I don't know, the camaraderie that comes with being in a physical space, not only seeing the film, but then, Q&As, like the energy of a room totally influences both the questions and the reception of the questions, right? I mean, I've had a really great time being here, but I think there's definitely a shift, right? being able
Yes.
to be in front of a person and not necessarily a screen. But yeah, I think I agree. I second all that Lívia said.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was kind of a convoluted question, but I asked because as a programmer, but also I write about the history of experimental film, and we have these generational shifts. You got the 60s and 70s generation who were going to die with their boots on, like Kubelka or something. My work has to be shown on film in a project, and then the generation that I'm kind of more a part of is kind of more Catholic and willing to wants that, but also kind of willing to engage in other sorts of spaces. And I see you guys as kind of a newer generation where digital streaming, a lot of these things are just kind of facts for your generation of makers. And so it's interesting to me to know how that awareness works itself into your films and what you want to see your films do in the world. So sorry to throw that at you. It's just my own interest, and I'm the only one asking questions because we're not in person, right? So, well, this has been fascinating. This has been really wonderful. I want to thank you both for taking part. And if you have, it's possible because of the streaming that you could watch this Q&A before watching the films. I highly recommend that you watch Land in Sight and Goat because they're both lovely and hold out for me a lot of future for this this medium. So Paige and Lívia, thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It
for
was
having
awesome. Me. Yeah, thank you. And I want to see your film, Paige.
I want to see yours too.
Thank you.
Cool.
Excellent.